carriage lurched around the last bend in the road, and Elinor Voss grabbed the leather strap above the door before she was thrown sideways. Outside the window, the iron gates of Ashworth Park swung open wide, held by two footmen in matching grey coats who stared straight ahead as though the gravel beneath their feet was the most interesting thing in the world. Elinor watched them through the glass. She had been watching things from windows her whole life. It was a skill she had quietly perfected, while everyone around her performed their arrivals. The gates closed behind her carriage with a sound like a verdict. She had not wanted to come. She had told her mother this 3 times in the week before, using different arrangements of the same words, hoping one combination would land differently. Her mother had responded to each version with the same serene smile, the one that meant the matter had already been decided, and the conversation was simply a formality Elinor was choosing to extend. The Ashworth reunion happened every 2 years. 60 or 70 people spread across a house that could hold twice that number without straining, all of them connected by blood or marriage, or the particular kind of obligation that passed itself off as affection in families of a certain standing. Elinor was connected by blood. Specifically, she was connected through her mother's sister, who had married into the Ashworth name 30 years ago and never let anyone forget that it had been her choice, her elevation, and her gift to the extended family. That sister's daughter was Cecily. Elinor had known Cecily for as long as she could remember, which meant she had known her own secondary position for as long as she could remember. This was not a dramatic thing. It was not a wound she nursed or a grievance she fed. It was simply a fact of her life, the way the river in the village ran east and not west, the way winter came without being invited. Cecily was beautiful in the way that drew rooms toward her like iron filings to a magnet. She was clever enough to seem effortless, and just careful enough to never actually appear to be trying. She had a laugh that arrived ahead of the rest of her, bright and unhesitating, the laugh of someone who had never once doubted that she was welcome wherever she stood. Elinor's laugh, when it came, arrived quietly, like it was apologizing for the interruption. The carriage stopped. A footman opened the door and stood holding it, waiting. Elinor descended the 2 steps and stood on the gravel drive, and for a moment she just looked at the house. It was enormous in the way that old houses are enormous, not showy but settled, as though it had simply grown out of the ground over several centuries and was no longer paying attention to itself. The stone was the color of old honey in the late afternoon light. Roses climbed the east wing in a riot of pink that someone had clearly tried to manage and then given up on. It was, she admitted silently, a beautiful place to be miserable in. Elinor. She turned. Her Aunt Frances was already crossing the gravel toward her, arms outstretched, wearing an expression of such coordinated warmth that Elinor almost flinched at the precision of it. She accepted the embrace. She smelled lavender and powder and the faint, familiar scent of something that money buys when it wants to smell like virtue. "You look well," Frances said, holding Elinor at arm's length and examining her the way someone examines a room they're not sure they want to rent. "Thank you, Aunt Frances. The house looks beautiful. Doesn't it? We've had the south garden entirely replanted. You must see it before you go." The phrase "before you go" landed in the first minute of Elinor's arrival with the quiet efficiency of a reminder about her departure. Frances took her arm and steered her toward the entrance. "Cecily has been absolutely electric. She arrived yesterday with Lady Morse and 3 of her friends from London. There's such an atmosphere." Elinor nodded and let herself be walked inside. The entrance hall was exactly as she remembered it, black and white marble floors that made every footstep sound like a statement, a staircase that curved up to a landing where a painted ancestor stared down at all visitors with mild suspicion. Voices came from every direction. A child ran across the hall and vanished behind a door. Somewhere above them, someone was playing a piano, slowly, working through the same 4 bars repeatedly, stopping at the same place each time. "Your room is the blue room on the 2nd floor, Frances said. "The same one as last time. I hope that suits." The same one as last time. The room that looked out over the kitchen garden and received the morning light only between 8 and 9 before the angle changed. The room with the writing desk that wobbled unless you put a book under one leg. Elinor had brought a book for exactly this purpose, having remembered it during the carriage ride. "It suits perfectly," she said. She was shown upstairs by a young housemaid who walked quickly and talked about the weather in Yorkshire with genuine enthusiasm. Elinor listened and responded and asked the girl's name, which was Ada, and whether she had always worked at the house, which she had not. She had come from the village the previous autumn when her older sister married and moved to Leeds. Elinor found she was genuinely interested in this, the way she was always genuinely interested in the small details of people's actual lives, which was possibly why she had never learned the art of being interesting to people who were not interested in real things. The blue room was as she remembered it. She set down her traveling bag, removed her coat, and went to the window. The kitchen garden stretched below in tidy rows. Someone was picking something from the far end, bending and moving along a row with the slow patience of someone who had all the time in the world. Elinor watched until the person straightened up, gathered their basket, and walked back toward the house. Then she turned away from the window and sat down on the edge of the bed. Downstairs the voices rose and fell. The piano stopped. Somewhere closer on the same floor or the one above, a door opened and she heard Cecily's laugh, just a fragment of it, traveling through the walls the way Cecily's laugh always traveled, freely, as though walls were optional. Elinor sat still on the edge of the bed for 1 full minute. She counted it. Then she stood up, smoothed her dress, and went to find her place in the gathering. The drawing room held 16 people when she arrived, and none of them were looking at the door when she entered. This was not unusual. She moved to the edge of the group near the window and accepted a glass of something cold and pale from a passing tray, and she began the quiet work of reading the room, which she had always done the way other people breathed. Her cousin Oliver was there, near the fireplace, talking about horses with a man Elinor didn't recognize. Oliver was kind to her in an absent way, the way people are kind when they have no reason to be unkind and no particular investment in either direction. His wife Harriet was beside him, wearing a necklace that looked new and touching it occasionally, as if confirming it was still there. The 3 women from London whom Cecily had brought were arranged on the settee in a composition that looked accidental but wasn't. They were all beautiful in slightly different ways, as though Cecily had curated them for variety. They were talking with a speed that suggested they had not actually stopped talking since leaving London 2 days ago. And then, across the room, Cecily herself. She had her back to the door, but she turned at the moment Elinor entered, not because she heard her. Elinor had been very quiet, but because Cecily had a talent for detecting the arrival of an audience she hadn't yet addressed. She turned and her face opened into a smile of such genuine-seeming warmth that Elinor felt the old, familiar thing, the inability to be entirely sure whether the warmth was real or performed, and the growing suspicion that the question was itself naive, that Cecily had long ago stopped knowing the difference herself. Elinor, she crossed the room in 4 steps and took both of Elinor's hands. Her grip was warm and firm. "You're here, I was starting to worry. Mother said your carriage was delayed." "Only by 20 minutes. 20 minutes, Cecily said it as though 20 minutes was a harrowing interval, an ordeal survived. Then she looped her arm through Elinor's and turned her toward the room. "Come. You must meet everyone." Everyone was, in Cecily's world, the people Cecily had chosen to gather. Elinor knew 2 of them and was introduced to the rest with the easy fluency of someone for whom social architecture was a native language. She moved through the introductions, said the right things, smiled at the right moments, and felt the gentle but unmistakable sensation of being absorbed into Cecily's orbit the way a moon is absorbed into a planet's gravity, smoothly, efficiently, and without particular acknowledgement. Dinner was announced at 7. Elinor found her seat, read the placement card, and noted that she was positioned between Oliver's younger brother, George, who was pleasant and had nothing interesting to say, and an older woman named Mrs. Hartley, who appeared to have strong opinions about drainage in the north of England. Elinor spent the soup course hearing about drainage. She found herself paying careful, genuine attention, because Mrs. Hartley had actually thought about this. She had letters from engineers and figures, and a specific case from 3 winters ago that illustrated her point precisely. By the fish course, Elinor had contributed 2 observations that made Mrs. Hartley regard her with surprised respect. This was the shape of Elinor's social life. She was interesting to the people no one else was talking to. She was invisible to the room. These things had, over many years, come to feel like the same thing. At the far end of the table, Cecily was incandescent. The 4 people nearest her were all angled toward her, the way sunflowers manage their direction without seeming to decide. She told a story that Elinor couldn't quite hear the words of but could follow entirely from the faces around it, the slow lean-in, the shared suspense, the eruption of laughter at the end. One of the men wiped his eye. Cecily looked delighted and not surprised, which was exactly the correct expression for someone who had just done something they knew would work. Elena ate her fish and asked Mrs. Hartley how many letters she had received in response to her proposal about the Drainage Inspection Committee. After dinner, the party separated in the way of houses like this, the men to one room, the women to another, though the arrangement was already dissolving at the edges as it always did in modern gatherings where the old formalities held only half their force. Elena went to the library. She told herself she would stay only a few minutes. She stayed an hour. The library was tall and dark and smelled of old leather and the particular stillness that collects in rooms full of things that don't need you. She moved along the shelves with her fingers trailing the spines, not reading the titles, just feeling the texture of them. She pulled one out. Put it back, pulled another. This one she opened, standing in the middle of the room, and read 3 pages before she was aware she had started. When she finally went back to the drawing room, most of the party had thinned. Cecily was still there, however, the center of the remaining 6 people, her hair still perfect, her voice still carrying. She looked up when Elena entered and smiled with a warmth that held, somewhere inside it, the particular satisfaction of someone who has been right about something for a long time. Elena smiled back. She sat down near the edge of the group and accepted a cup of tea that had gone slightly cool. She listened to the conversation Cecily was leading, which was about a wedding she had attended in the spring and the various complications that had accompanied it. And she noticed that Cecily told the story well, with real timing and a gift for the kind of detail that made a moment vivid. She noticed also that Cecily never once directed a question toward Elena. This was not malice. That was the thing that Elena had spent years understanding. It was not cruelty in the active sense. It was simply the natural behavior of someone who had organized the world around herself and found the organization comfortable. Elena was part of the world. She was background. She was the frame that the painting sat in, useful, necessary even, but not the thing you looked at. When Elena finally went upstairs, the house was quieting around her. She sat at the wobbling writing desk and opened the book she had brought, the one she had also brought a spare copy of 3 years ago to the Harrington house, the copy that she had been reading aloud in a low voice in the garden because she had assumed, reasonably, that the garden was empty. She had not assumed that the windows of the east-facing sitting room were open. She had not known that the sitting room was occupied. She had heard the laughter from inside before she realized what it was directed at. She opened the book now to the page she had been reading that evening. The words were the same as they had always been. The poem sat on the page in its old, quiet confidence, unchanged by what had happened to her because of it. She read it to herself, silently, in the blue room above the kitchen garden. Then she put the book face down on the desk, pressed her hand flat on the cover for a moment, and went to bed. The house settled around her, full of people who would wake tomorrow and arrange themselves again in the same patterns, the same orbits, the same gentle hierarchies that no one acknowledged and everyone obeyed. Elena lay in the dark and listened to it settling. She was here for 5 days. She had survived worse. Sleep came eventually, the way it always did, arriving without announcement, as though it had been waiting quietly in the corner of the room and had simply decided the time was right. The morning of the second day arrived with the kind of brightness that makes the previous night feel like it belonged to a different week. Light came through the blue room's window at an angle that lasted exactly as long as Elena had remembered, from 8 o'clock to 9, before it shifted, and the room went soft and gray again. She used the full hour. She dressed, she read, she drank the tea that Ada brought without being asked, which meant Ada was either perceptive or had been told, and either way Elena found she was grateful. Breakfast at Ashworth Park was not a formal event. The sideboard in the morning room held a permanent arrangement of dishes that were replenished as needed between 8 and 10, and people arrived when they wished, which meant the room held a rotating cast of half-awake faces and deliberate conversations, and the occasional burst of energy from someone who had slept well and was announcing this through their posture. Elena arrived at 8:30. The room held 6 people. One of them was George, who had a newspaper and a cup of coffee and the particular absent expression of a man who had already decided this was going to be a good morning and was protecting the decision. He nodded at Elena. She nodded back. This was, she reflected, an entirely satisfying social exchange. She filled a plate, found a chair near the window, and began to eat. The garden outside was already occupied. 2 of Cecily's London friends, whose names Elena was still sorting, were walking along the gravel path in matching morning dresses, talking with their heads tilted toward each other. The taller one gestured broadly with one arm and the other laughed and caught her sleeve. They looked like a painting of people having a good time, which Alina understood was not the same as actually having one, though she could not be entirely sure of the difference from this distance. Cecily arrived at 9:20. This was later than the others, which was its own kind of message, though not necessarily an intentional one. Cecily was simply someone for whom time arranged itself around her requirements rather than the reverse. She came in wearing pale blue, her hair already dressed, and her color already high from what was presumably a walk, and she scanned the room with the efficient instinct of someone taking inventory, noted Alina at the window, smiled, filled her plate, and came to sit beside her. "You went to bed early," she said. "I was tired from the journey." "You're always tired from journeys. You should travel more, it gets easier." She broke a piece of bread with both hands in a way that was somehow elegant. "Did you sleep?" "Well enough." Cecily studied her for a moment with the expression of someone who has decided to say something and is choosing the moment. "Mother asked if you were all right. Last night, I mean. She said you seemed quiet." Alina kept her face entirely neutral. "I was quiet. I'm often quiet. Your mother has known me for 27 years. She worries in her way." This was a careful sentence, Alina noted. It acknowledged something without naming it, the way a map acknowledges territory without explaining what it's like to walk through it. In her way covered a great deal of ground. "That's kind of her," Alina said. Cecily tilted her head slightly, the way she did when she was adjusting her reading of a situation. Then she smiled. "We're doing parlor games tonight, proper ones with scoring. I've told Mother it's the only way to get everyone in the same room for long enough to actually talk." "Will you play?" "If there's room." "There's always room for you." Cecily said it warmly and meant it, in exactly the way that you mean something when what you mean is primarily for yourself. The morning moved through the house like water through sand, finding the low places, spreading out. Alina spent an hour in the garden with Mrs. Hartley, who had brought her letters and wanted to show Alina the relevant passages about soil gradient. Alina read them carefully and meant every word of her responses. Then she walked the perimeter of the east lawn with Oliver, who asked her about her work, which was painting modest things for modest money, watercolors mostly, and she told him she had done 3 commissions that year and was working on a 4th. He said he hadn't known, and she said there was no particular reason he would have, and they both accepted this without discomfort. She was back in her room by noon when the light was flat and the house had a midday quiet that felt like held breath. She painted for an hour, a small sketch of the kitchen garden from memory, the rows and the figure she had seen picking things in the afternoon light. She was not trying to produce anything. She was simply keeping her hands busy while her mind sat quietly inside itself. Afternoon brought a change in the texture of the house. More carriages arrived through the afternoon hours, rolling up the drive in 1s and 2s, disgorging people and luggage with the cheerful industriousness of a tide coming in. Alina watched from the library window as the numbers in the garden below gradually increased. She counted 40 people by 4 o'clock, which meant there were at least as many she hadn't seen yet. It was during this watch that she first noticed the man who arrived alone. His carriage came at 4:30 later than the rest, with no announcement that she heard. It was a plain carriage, well made but without decoration, and the driver handled it with the economy of someone who had been somewhere and was now arriving somewhere else, without particular ceremony about either. The man who stepped out was tall. That was the first thing she registered. He moved with a kind of unhurried certainty, the way people move when they are comfortable in their own bodies, not because they are proud of them, but simply because they have learned to inhabit them well. He stood for a moment on the gravel and looked at the house, not in the way new arrivals looked at it, sizing it up or being impressed or comparing it to somewhere else they had been. He looked at it the way you look at something you have seen before and are seeing again with fresh eyes, noting what has changed and what hasn't. Then he went inside. Alina closed her book and looked at the space where he had been standing. She did not know who he was. She would learn later that he was Lord Ashworth's oldest friend from university, a man named Edmund Carew, and that he had not been expected at the reunion at all, which was why Francis had not announced him and why his arrival had come so late and so quietly. She would learn all of this later. For now, she only knew what she had seen. a man who moved as though he was not waiting for anyone's permission. She went back to her book. At 7, the party gathered for what Francis had designated an informal supper, which meant 52 people in the great dining room with the long tables and the candlelight and the particular acoustic that made every conversation carry further than intended. Elinor found her seat, a different one than the night before, slightly further from the end, and she settled in with the same readiness she brought to every gathering, ready to be useful to whoever needed her attention, ready to be invisible to whoever didn't. The man from the carriage arrived last. She knew it was him before she saw him clearly because the room shifted, just slightly, the way a room does when someone enters who carries a quality that other people register unconsciously. He came to the last empty chair which happened to be beside Elinor. He pulled it out, sat down without looking at the placement card, and accepted the wine that a footman offered him. Then he looked at Elinor. Not as an introduction. Not with the smile that people put on when they are preparing to introduce themselves. He looked at her the way you look at someone you are simply acknowledging, one human being to another, without performance. Caro, he said, just the name offered plainly. Voss, she said, Elinor. He nodded. He looked at the table, at the assembled faces, with the same quality of attention she had noticed from the window, present, particular, not performing the act of being interested but simply being it. The supper began. She noticed, over the course of the next 2 hours, several things about Edmund Caro. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was with precision, not the precision of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say, but the precision of someone who thought before they opened their mouth and was only offering what they had actually thought. He was not performing disinterest. He was simply not performing anything. At the far end of the table, Cecily was in full effect. The laughter from her end came in regular waves, perfectly timed, and Elinor caught fragments of stories she was telling, a hunt she had attended, a diplomatic incident at a dinner party in London, a remark made by someone titled that had caused a minor sensation. She was good at this. Elinor had always acknowledged this freely. Cecily was genuinely good at holding a room. Edmund Caro, she noticed, did not look toward Cecily's end of the table even once. This was not obvious rudeness. It was simply that he was looking at what was in front of him, which was the conversation to his left about the upcoming county show, and then, when that concluded, the view through the window at the dark garden, and then briefly at Elinor, who was listening to the county show conversation with the particular quality of attention she gave to things that were actually interesting to her. "You know something about this," he said when there was a pause. She looked at him. "About the county show. About whatever he just said that made you lean forward." She had not realized she had leaned forward. He mentioned the sheep breeding program at the Morley farm. "I know the Morley farm. I painted it 2 years ago." Caro considered this, and they've done extraordinary work with the flock. It's not well known, but it should be. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not categorize. Then he said, "Tell me about the farm." So she did. She talked for 4 minutes about the Morley farm, the light on the hill in early morning, the way the sheep moved through the lower field, the older Morley daughter who had taken over the breeding records and had a system so organized it could have run a bank. She talked and he listened without filling the silences with reassurance or performing interest. He was simply there, attending. When she finished, he said, "You paint." "Yes. Is it the income or the thing itself?" It was a direct question. People rarely asked her direct questions. "Both," she said, "but if I had to choose, it would be the thing itself." He nodded as though this confirmed something he had already surmised. Then the conversation at the table shifted and they were drawn into its current, and the particular quiet channel they had found closed again, naturally, without drama. But Elinor sat slightly differently for the rest of the meal. She did not analyze why. After supper, the party moved to the long drawing room, where Francis had arranged the evening's entertainment. There were card tables in the corner, a small group around the piano, and at the center, under the main chandelier, Cecily stood with a list in her hand and an expression of cheerful authority. "We're doing the parlor games," she announced, in the voice she used when announcing things she had already decided. "Everyone is participating. I will not hear objections." There was the expected light laughter of people who were happy to be organized. Elinor found a chair near the edge. It was, she noticed, the same kind of chair she always found, near the edge, positioned for observation, for engagement when called upon, for retreat when not. She watched Cecily organize the room. She was, Elinor thought, watching her cousin move between groups with the smooth confidence of someone who had never doubted her right to be at the center of any gathering. She was watching someone who had been trained from childhood to believe that the room was made for her. And the room agreed. The room had always agreed. Edmund Caro arrived in the doorway of the drawing room and stopped there, reading the arrangement, making his assessment. His eyes moved around the space and then found Elinor where she sat near the edge, and he crossed the room directly and sat in the chair beside her. Not the chair across from her, the one beside. Games, he said, as a statement of fact. Apparently, she said. There was a brief pause. Outside, the wind moved through the garden. The piano in the corner started up again, a cheerful thing in a major key. Are you good at them? He asked. Elinor considered the question honestly. At the games themselves, yes. At the part where you're meant to be charmingly bad at them so that other people can be good at you, no. He looked at her for a moment, then he said good, in a tone that she couldn't quite read, but that felt somehow like the beginning of something. The games were called to order. Cecily stood at the center of the room, radiant and certain, holding her list. Elinor straightened in her chair. She was here for 5 days. She had not yet decided what kind of 5 days they would be. The parlor games began in the way that Cecily organized most things, with apparent spontaneity and actual precision. She announced the rules of the first contest with the ease of someone who had been thinking about this for considerably longer than she was letting on. It was a game of wit and recall, 5 rounds, 3 players competing at a time, while the rest of the room scored on small cards that Ada and 2 other maids handed around with expressions of careful neutrality. The first 3 players were selected, not Elinor. She was not surprised. She watched from her chair near the edge of the room and paid the kind of attention to the game that most people in the room were not paying. The kind that tracked not just the answers but the patterns beneath them, what each person reached for first, what they hesitated on, where the room was inclined to reward charm over accuracy and where it did the reverse. Edmund Caro sat beside her with his card on his knee. He was scoring with the same economy he applied to everything. The first round finished. Cecily announced the scores with bright precision. The winner was a man named Philip Gorton who played to the room, and the room played back with generous enthusiasm. He bowed with self-deprecating delight. People applauded. The second round was called. 2 of the players changed. Elinor's name was called as the third. She stood and moved to the center of the room without hesitating. Hesitation, she had learned, was the thing that invited a certain kind of attention you could not then redirect. She took her place between Philip Gorton, who was staying on from round 1, and one of Cecily's London friends whose name was Charlotte. Cecily announced the round. The room settled. The first question was about geography. Elinor answered correctly before Philip finished drawing breath. The second was about history, and she answered that too, not quickly this time. She let it sit for half a beat, which was not performance. She simply wanted to be sure she was right. She was right. The third was a question about poetry, a fragment of a poem to be completed, and Elinor heard it and felt something move through her that was entirely involuntary. She completed it, all 3 remaining lines, without a pause. The room was quiet for a moment, in a way it hadn't been quiet before. Then Charlotte to her left said something light and clever about the unfairness of the draw, and the room laughed and the moment dissolved. But it dissolved differently than the moments before it. The scoring cards were marked. Cecily collected them and totaled them with the smooth efficiency she brought to all administrative tasks, which she performed beautifully and pretended to find beneath her. She announced the scores. Elinor had won the round. The silence, this time, lasted approximately 2 seconds longer than the silence after Philip Gorton's win. Then the applause came, and it was genuine, but it had a texture to it that Elinor recognized the way you recognize an old piece of furniture in a new room. The same thing in a slightly wrong place. She received it with a small nod and returned to her chair. Edmund Caro was looking at the scoring card in his hand. His expression gave nothing away. As she sat down, he said without looking up, "The last poem, who wrote it?" She told him. He made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite surprise, something between the two. "I would have said the same poet's earlier work." The earlier work is more well-known, she said. The later one is better. He looked up then. Why? This was the second direct question he had asked her. She found she was not uncomfortable with direct questions, only with the kind that were actually instructions in disguise. His were not. Because in the earlier one he's showing you the feeling, she said. In the later one he trusts you to have it yourself. Another of those pauses that felt like something being considered, rather than something being avoided. Yes, he said simply. The third round began. Elena was not in it. She watched and scored and kept her card carefully. Charlotte won the third round by a narrow margin, which Cecily announced with warmth and a particular brightness in her eyes that Elena had seen before, the brightness of a person who finds things returning to their correct order. During the break between rounds, the room rearranged itself in the way of gatherings, clusters forming and dissolving, people moving toward the drinks tray or the window or each other. Elena sat and watched and sipped her tea, which was still warm. She did not move to join a cluster. She never moved first. It was not shyness, not exactly. It was a long habit of waiting to see whether she would be invited and then, upon discovering she would not, deciding whether to mind. She had mostly stopped minding. Cecily appeared at her shoulder. She sat in the chair Edmund Caro had vacated when he went to speak with Oliver near the fireplace. She sat close, in the way of private confidences, and Elena turned to meet her. You were wonderful, Cecily said. She meant it. This was the confusing part, the part Elena had never entirely resolved in 27 years. Cecily often meant what she said. The meaning was simply not the whole of the thing. I didn't know you knew the poem. I've read it several times. You always read more than anyone knows. Cecily said this with something that was genuinely fond, and Elena accepted it as the thing it was, a complicated gift. Then Cecily leaned slightly closer and lowered her voice. I should warn you. Mother is thinking about the seating for tomorrow's dinner. I think she may put you near Mr. Hartley. A brief, careful pause. He talks about drainage. Elena said nothing. I thought you'd want to know, Cecily said, as warmly as someone delivering news they have decided is kind because it is accurate. Elena looked at her cousin's face, the genuine beauty of it, the practiced ease of it, the way it arranged itself so naturally into expressions that were technically correct. Thank you, she said. Cecily squeezed her hand and rose and returned to the center of the room, which returned to her like a tide returning to shore. The fourth round began. 3 new players. The questions were harder now, the game warming up as games do when a room begins to forget that it is playing and starts simply competing. There was a question about mathematics that no one got right, which produced a communal relief. There was a question about recent events in Parliament that Philip Gorton answered with confident wrongness, which the room accepted and Cecily only gently corrected. Then there was a question about art. It was addressed to the room at large, one of the format's open rounds, and Cecily read it clearly. It was specific, a technique, a period, a painter. The room murmured. A few tentative answers surfaced. None of them were right. Elena said nothing. She was not in this round. She held her scoring card. After a moment, Edmund Caro spoke from near the fireplace. Elena would know. The room turned. Or rather, the room's attention turned, which was not exactly the same thing but produced a similar effect. Cecily looked at her. Oliver looked at her. The 3 London friends, Charlotte and the others, looked at her. Elena kept her expression level. The technique is sfumato, she said. The period is early Italian Renaissance. The painter in question is known for using it in the backgrounds of portraits rather than the figures themselves, which is the part of the question that narrows it. She gave the painter's name. The room received this. There was a pause of the particular quality that follows accuracy. Cecily smiled. It was a real smile, Elena thought, and also something else. Caro returned to his chair beside her. He said nothing about the answer. He didn't need to. The 5th and final round was different in form. Cecily announced it as a round of personal wit, each player to respond to a statement with whatever they genuinely thought, judged by the room not for being correct but for being true. It was the kind of game that sounded freeing and was in practice the most rigorously social of all, because what it was actually measuring was how well you could perform authenticity for a room. Elena was called for this round. She stood again. Beside her were Philip Gorton again and one of Cecily's friends, the one named Anna, who had a smile that arrived in fractions. The statement given to them was about solitude, whether it was something to be sought or merely survived. Philip Gorton gave a charming answer about needing people around him, which was certainly true, and which the room rewarded warmly. Anna said that solitude was something she thought she enjoyed until she was actually in it, which was honest enough to produce genuine laughter. Then it was Eleanor's turn. She stood in the center of the room with all of it looking at her and said, clearly and without apology, "Solitude is the place where I find out what I actually think. Without it, I'm only ever assembling a version of what I've heard." The room was quiet. Not the polite quiet of before, a different quiet. Then the scoring cards moved. When Cecily collected them and totaled the scores, the expression on her face shifted by something very small. She announced the result with perfect composure and the same brightness in her voice that she had maintained all evening. Eleanor had won the final round. She had won more rounds than anyone. She returned to her chair and sat down. Edmund Caro said very quietly, not for the room, "That's what you mean about the poem." "Yes," she said. "Exactly." Outside, the wind had picked up. The candles along the mantelpiece bent and steadied. The room was beginning to thin as the hour grew late, the card players packing up, the groups near the piano drifting toward the door. Cecily moved through the remaining guests with the ease of someone who belongs in every room she enters. She caught Eleanor's eye once across the space between them and smiled with the full warmth of her considerable warmth. Eleanor smiled back. She was tired, but it was a different kind of tired than the night before. She found the library for half an hour before bed, running her fingers along the shelves in the dark without lighting a lamp, knowing where things were by memory, by texture, by the faint smell of old paper that different books carried in different concentrations. She pulled one and held it without opening it. She thought about what she had said in the game, the part about assembling versions of what she had heard. She thought about Edmund Caro saying the poem and meaning it. She put the book back on the shelf. She went upstairs to the blue room and sat at the wobbling desk and wrote 3 lines in her notebook. Not a letter and not a diary entry, just 3 lines, the way she sometimes did when something needed to be said and there was no one to say it to. She crossed out one of the lines, the other 2 she left. Then she went to bed. The house was deep in its night quiet. Somewhere far off in the house, a clock ticked with patient, uncelebrated steadiness. Eleanor lay in the dark and listened to it, counting without meaning to, losing count, starting again. She was not assembling anything. She was just thinking. By the 3rd morning, the house had settled into its rhythm. The reunion had found its pace the way all gatherings do after the first excitement of arrival fades and people stop performing the freshness of their enthusiasm. The drawing room before breakfast held the same faces in the same general positions. The sideboard held the same dishes in the same arrangement. The conversations were deeper now, less curated, more honest in the way that the 3rd day always produces, when the energy required to be entirely on guard has begun to cost more than people are willing to spend. Eleanor noticed all of this from the window where she sat with her tea and her notebook, the notebook open to a blank page that she had been not writing in for 20 minutes. The morning was overcast. The kitchen garden below was a softer green than the past 2 days, the light diffused and even, the kind of light that painters call generous because it forgives mistakes and shows texture rather than shadow. She had her watercolors set up on the writing desk but had not touched them yet. She was looking at the garden and thinking about something that was not the garden. She was thinking about the game last night. Not about winning it. She was not particularly someone who organized her thinking around victories. She was thinking about the moment when Edmund Caro said her name to the room, the ease of it, the lack of ceremony. As though directing the room's attention toward her was simply the rational thing to do because she happened to know the answer, and that was that. She had been in rooms for 27 years. She knew how rooms worked. Someone like her was not, ordinarily, the person whose name a man like Caro said into a room. She was still working out what she thought about this when the door of her room opened after a brief knock, and Cecily came in, wearing a walking dress and carrying gloves, already fully assembled for the morning in a way that suggested she had been up for hours. "Walk," she said, "the south garden, come." It was not quite an invitation, it never quite was. Eleanor closed her notebook, capped her pen, and reached for her coat. The south garden, newly replanted, was laid out in a formal pattern of low hedges and gravel paths that had not yet been worn soft by use. The roses were a month from their best but promising, showing color at the tips. They walked for a few minutes in the comfortable silence of people who have known each other long enough to have earned a silence. Then Cecily said, "What do you make of him?" Alina did not ask who she meant. "I've spoken with him twice. More than most people have managed in 2 days." Cecily's voice was even pleasant. "He's not very social, is he?" "He seemed social enough." With you, a brief pause, the gravel crunched under their feet. "He's a duke, you know, Edmund Caro, the Duke of Aldermere. Gerald mentioned it this morning. I hadn't known." Alina had not known either. She filed this away with the same careful neutrality with which she filed most things. "He doesn't behave like someone who expects you to know," she said. No, Cecily considered this. That's either very genuine or very well performed. She looked sideways at Alina with an expression that was analyzing and affectionate in equal parts, one of those expressions that was genuinely both things because Cecily was genuinely complicated. Don't read too much into it. Alina looked at the roses. Into what? The attention. He's kind to everyone individually. It's a skill like anything else. This was delivered with warmth. Alina received it as such. "I'm sure you're right," she said. They walked to the end of the path and turned back. The house rose ahead of them, solid and domestic, smoke beginning from one of the eastern chimneys. A maid was hanging something in a window on the second floor. A dog Alina hadn't seen before appeared from around the corner of the stone wall and regarded them without alarm. "Mother wants to rearrange the seating for tonight," Cecily said, returning to practical matters with the ease of someone who keeps both registers available at all times. "She's putting you near Mr. Beale, I think. He's the one who talked to you about the sheep." "The county show man," Alina nodded. "He asked specifically," Cecily added. "Apparently you said something about a farm he knows." Alina looked at the dog, which had decided they were uninteresting and was moving on. She said nothing. The morning proceeded. By midday, the house had organized itself into the day's activities in the way of large family gatherings, where everyone has tacitly agreed that there should be activities without anyone wanting to be responsible for them. There was a walking group forming for the Eastern Trail. There was a group staying in to play cards. Oliver had set up a shooting arrangement in the south field that was attended mostly by men who stood in a loose line and disagreed pleasantly about technique. Alina was in the library. She had been there since 11, when the walking party had departed and the card players had settled, and the house had achieved the midday quiet that she was beginning to think of as her favorite time of day here. She was reading in a chair that had been lived in for so long it had taken the shape of reading, or perhaps the shape of a particular person who used to read, and she had the particular comfort of fitting inside someone else's comfortable habit. At 11:30, the door opened. Edmund Caro came in, saw her, and did not leave. He scanned the shelves for a moment, then crossed to the section to her left and studied the spines with the same methodical attention he seemed to bring to everything. He pulled a book. He read the first page standing up. He put it back and pulled another. He read 3 pages of that one. He moved to the chair opposite her without asking, which she found she did not mind, and sat down with the second book. They read in silence for 20 minutes. Then he said, without looking up, "The thing you said last night about solitude." "Yes, Is it always true, or was it the truest thing you could say in front of that particular room?" She thought about this seriously, the way he seemed to expect serious thought. "Both," she said finally. "It would have been true in front of any room, but in front of that room it was also the most honest thing available to me that wasn't going to require explaining." He looked up at that. What would have required explaining? She hesitated, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she was deciding whether to give it. "That solitude is also the place I go when rooms have been doing what rooms do, so I can find out which parts of what just happened were real." A pause. The house was quiet around them. Someone far away was hammering something, a regular sound, useful and unobtrusive. "And last night," he said. She met his eyes, which were steady and not performing anything. "Last night I'm still working out." He accepted this without pushing it further, which was, she thought, the correct response. He went back to his book. She went back to hers. They read for another hour. She left first, not because she wanted to, but because lunch was being laid and Ada had looked in twice to see if she was coming. As she rose, she looked at the shelves and, on an impulse she had not planned, pulled a slim volume from the third shelf and held it out to him. "Read the second section," she said, "not the first." The first is where everyone starts, and it's the worst part. He took it from her without saying thank you, which might have seemed rude from anyone else. From him it seemed simply accurate. He had not received it as a favor, he had received it as information. She left him in the library and went to lunch. The afternoon brought a change. The overcast cleared around 2 o'clock and the light came down sharp and flat and turned the garden into something precise and well-defined that made Alina's fingers itch for her brushes. She excused herself after lunch and spent 2 hours in the blue room, properly painting this time, 2 small pieces, both of the garden, both trying to catch the quality of that specific light. They were, she thought, good. She did not often let herself think this. It felt too much like a claim, but they were honestly good, and she sat back and looked at them and allowed herself to know it. Downstairs, the house began its afternoon preparations for the evening. The sounds of rearrangement traveled through the floors, furniture being moved, voices coordinating, the distant clatter of kitchen work rising to meet its daily deadline. Alina cleaned her brushes. She thought about what Cecily had said in the garden, don't read too much into it. She thought about the library. She thought about the particular way a person can be present with you without making a production of their presence, without performing interest or engineering connection, without expecting gratitude for the attention they have paid. She looked at the 2 small paintings drying on the desk. She decided she would not give them away, she would keep them. She was allowed to keep things that were genuinely good. Downstairs, the house was full and warming and alive with the particular energy of people who have spent a day becoming more themselves than they had arrived as. Alina could hear it through the floorboards, through the walls, the specific music of a gathering that has passed its formal introduction and found its real register. She put on her evening dress. She did not look in the mirror for longer than necessary. She went down the stairs and into the drawing room where the evening was already beginning, and she looked for the chair near the edge, the one she always found, and then she stopped. She sat somewhere else. Not the center, she was not doing that, but not the edge either. Somewhere in between, near a window, where the evening light was coming in sideways and turning everything amber, and where she could see the room and be seen in it, and where, when Edmund Caro came through the door and read the room and found her, there was nothing between them but a reasonable distance that could, if either of them chose, be crossed. She watched him cross it. She did not look away. The 4th afternoon arrived the way Cecily had always arrived, with full intention and without apology. Alina was in the garden at the time, the west garden this time, the one with the long stone wall and the lavender beds that ran beneath it in a purple haze that the bees found more interesting than anything else happening at Ashworth Park. She had her sketchbook. She was not sketching. She was sitting on the low wall with the sketchbook open on her knee and a pencil in her hand, and her mind somewhere above and to the left of where her body was, which had been happening more since the library afternoon. She heard Cecily before she saw her. The familiar sound, light and assured, coming around the stone corner with Charlotte and the other London friend, whose name was Phoebe, all 3 of them carrying the energy of people who have been together long enough to have run out of new material, and are therefore performing the existing material with increased emphasis. They came around the corner, and Cecily saw Alina, and redirected toward her with the smooth efficiency of someone who has found something useful. "Here she is," Cecily said, as though Alina had been looked for, which she had not. She sat on the wall beside Alina with the ease of the very comfortable. Charlotte and Phoebe arranged themselves on the garden bench across the path with the ease of people accustomed to arranging themselves decoratively. The conversation that followed was the conversation Alina had been part of 100 times in different configurations. It moved from London to the reunion to people at the reunion to the games last night. Cecily told the story of the games with her customary skill, editing for comedy and narrative efficiency, and Alina's win appeared in the story the way a good supporting detail appears, present, correctly placed, adding something to the picture without claiming the picture. Charlotte laughed about the sfumato answer. "I had absolutely no idea," she said, with the cheerful confidence of someone for whom not knowing things was itself a social style. Phoebe asked Alina where she had learned it. "I paint," Alina said. "It comes up." "She's brilliant at it," Cecily said, with the warmth of a person generously conceding territory that costs her nothing. "Alina, show them your book." Alina looked down at the sketchbook on her knee. She had not been sketching. The open page held 3 pencil lines she had put there 10 minutes ago while her mind was elsewhere, and they were not a sketch of anything. They were the beginning of something she had abandoned. She closed the book. "Not today," she said pleasantly. Cecily's expression shifted for a fraction of a second, then it resettled into warmth. "Of course." The conversation moved on. Charlotte talked about a dinner party she had attended in June, where two people who had previously refused to be in the same room had been seated across from each other by what she suspected was deliberate arrangement. Phoebe contributed a story about a ball in May. Cecily listened to both and added details that improved them. Elinor sat on the wall and listened and contributed one well-timed observation that made them all laugh, and after which the conversation moved on without her again. Then Cecily, looking out at the garden with the expression of someone who has been waiting for the right moment in the conversation and has now found it, said, "I suppose you've all noticed Edmund Caro." Phoebe had, Charlotte had. Charlotte had, in fact, noticed him considerably, and said so with the precision of someone cataloging assets. "He's the Duke of Aldermere," Phoebe said. "Did you know, Gerald told my husband last night. Apparently he never announces it, he finds it tiresome." "I can imagine," Charlotte said, in a tone that made clear she could not imagine finding it tiresome at all. Cecily was smiling the smile she wore when she was the primary holder of relevant information. "I spoke with him this morning," she said. "On the East Terrace, we had a very interesting conversation." Elinor looked at the lavender. A bee moved along a stem, focused and unhurried. "He's coming to London in the autumn," Cecily continued, in the pleasant tone of someone reporting weather. "He mentioned it quite naturally. I said we were there most of the autumn season, which he already seemed to know somehow. He's a friend of the Carstairs, apparently, and we're at the Carstairs in October." Charlotte made a sound of pleased significance. Phoebe said, "How interesting," in the way people say interesting when they mean something specific and flattering. Cecily smiled and looked at Elinor with the warmth that was real and was also strategy. "You seemed to get on well with him yesterday, at dinner." "We spoke briefly," Elinor said. "He listened to you for quite a long time," Cecily said. "I noticed. He doesn't usually listen to people for long." This was delivered as something between an observation and an explanation, the kind of thing you say to someone to help them understand a situation correctly in advance before they misread it. Elinor looked at the bee on the lavender. "He's very direct," she said. "I find that easy to talk to." "Yes," Cecily said, "he is direct." A small pause. "He was direct with me as well this morning, asked what I did with my time. I told him about the London season, the social work I do with the charity committee. He nodded. He didn't say much after that. Men like that." She smoothed a wrinkle from her skirt. "They're attracted to certain kinds of people and not others. It's a particular type. Independent, quiet. But you can't take the quietness for depth. Usually it's just, well," she smiled, "shyness." Charlotte said, "Did you invite him to the Carstairs evening?" Cecily looked pleasantly surprised by the suggestion, which meant she had been waiting for it. "It would be natural enough, wouldn't it, if he's already a friend of the family?" Elinor put her sketchbook in her coat pocket. She stood up from the wall, smoothed her dress and said, "I'm going to walk before the light goes." She said it warmly and without hurry, and she meant it. She was going to walk. The light was genuinely changing. She did not slam anything or take anything sharply. She simply stood up and she left. She walked for 40 minutes along the Eastern Trail, the one the walking group had taken that morning but which was empty now. The light was low and amber, and it came through the tree line at the angle that Elinor associated with the specific feeling of having been somewhere for 3 days and knowing the quality of its particular late afternoon. She walked quickly at first, and then more slowly, and then, near the pond at the path's midpoint, she stopped. The pond was not large. A heron stood at the far edge on one leg, absolutely still. In that state herons achieve that is so complete it looks like performance but isn't. Elinor looked at the heron for a while. She was not angry. She had examined the thing Cecily had said from all its angles, and what she found was not anger exactly. It was something quieter and older than anger. It was the specific tiredness of having been managed. Managed with warmth, managed with skill, managed by someone who genuinely, in the complicated way that Cecily was genuine about things, cared about her. This was the architecture of it, the part that had always been difficult to name. Cecily was not cruel, Cecily was afraid. Of what exactly, Elinor had spent years trying to understand, and her best theory was that Cecily was afraid of being alone in a room she had not arranged, and that Elinor represented something uncontrolled, some version of a thing that didn't require the room to look at her to know her own worth, and that this was, to Cecily, a kind of threat so quiet and continuous that she had never had to name it either. The heron turned its head with the slow, unconcerned movement of something that had been standing in the same place long before Elena arrived, and would be standing there long after she left. Elena walked back to the house. She was calm by the time she reached the gate in the stone wall. She was, in fact, remarkably calm, with the particular quality of calm that comes not from resignation, but from something having been understood. Dinner was in 2 hours. She went upstairs to change. Ada knocked to offer help with her hair, which was its usual quiet refusal to behave in the directions that fashionable hair behaved, and Elena said yes today, because today she felt like her hair should behave, and Ada worked with it for 20 minutes with a patience that was itself a kind of skill, and produced something that was not the elaborate architecture of Cecily's arrangements but was neat, and Elena thought suitable. She went down at 10 minutes to the hour. The drawing room before dinner held the guests doing the thing guests do before dinner, standing in the groups that had formed over 3 days, and talking about the day's events and the evening ahead. Elena moved through the room to get a glass of something, and on her way back found herself stopped by Mr. Beale, the county show man, who had a specific question about the Morley farm that he had been saving since she'd mentioned it, and that he asked with the directness of someone for whom topic selection was based purely on interest. She answered him fully. They stood near the fireplace for 10 minutes and talked about sheep with complete seriousness. She was still talking about sheep when she became aware of Cecily across the room. Cecily was near the door, standing with Charlotte and Oliver, and she was talking with the animation of someone who has moved past the preliminary material and reached the main event of whatever story she was telling. Her hands were moving. Her face was doing the full range of what Cecily's face did when she was at her most effective. Elena watched across Mr. Beale's shoulder. She watched Cecily's face as it moved through the story, watched the expressions arrive and depart with their practiced precision. She watched the way the 3 people in front of her arranged themselves toward her, the unconscious lean of people being pulled by a current they hadn't chosen. And then she heard her own name. Not directed at her. Cecily did not look toward her. She heard it in the way you hear your name at a distance in a crowded room, the specific frequency of a particular combination of sounds that the human ear is calibrated to detect whether you are attending to it or not. She heard her name in Cecily's story. She could not hear all the words. She caught fragments, the name of the Harrington house, a specific phrase about a garden, the word poetry which landed with a particular weight because she had her own weight on that word and recognized it from a distance. And then the laughter. Charlotte's laugh first, then Oliver's lower, the laugh of a man who finds something genuinely funny and isn't bothering to manage how much. Then 2 others she couldn't identify. The laughter built the way laughter builds when a story is being told well, when the pacing has been managed and the detail has been specific and the room has been brought exactly to the place the teller intended. Elena looked at Mr. Beale, who was waiting for her answer about the lower field drainage. She answered, he responded. They continued talking about sheep. Behind her, Cecily was reaching the climax of the story. Elena knew the shape of it. She knew where the story ended because she had lived the ending, 3 years ago, in a garden she had believed to be empty, reading aloud to herself because she had not known the windows were open. She kept her face entirely still. She heard the peak of the laughter, the sustained note of it. And then she heard something else. A voice, low, not raised, not announcing itself, but present in the room and located, she understood immediately from the quality of the silence that came after it, directly behind her. She did not turn around immediately. Mr. Beale had not heard what she heard because Mr. Beale was facing away from the door and was thinking about soil drainage. But Elena heard it in the silence that followed Cecily's story, the silence that came not because the story had ended, but because the room had registered something that the story had not accounted for. She turned around. Edmund Carew was standing behind her. He had apparently been standing behind her for some portion of the story. She could not say how long. His face told her nothing about how much he had heard, which told her, because she had spent 3 days reading that face, that he had heard enough. He met her eyes. He did not look at Cecily. He did not look at the room, which was in the process of recalibrating. She could feel it without seeing it. the subtle adjustment of 50 people realizing that the story that had just been told had been told in front of the subject of it. He looked at Alina and said nothing, because he was someone who did not say things to fill silences that served a purpose. She held his gaze. The room was quiet in a way it had not been all evening. Then Cecily said her name lightly, warmly, with the instinctive recovery of someone who has been managing rooms since childhood. Alina, I was just telling them about the Harrington evening. You remember the poetry incident. I told it so badly you'll have to rescue my version. The room waited. Alina looked at Cecily's face. At the warmth of it, precise as a mechanism. At the invitation in it, which was also an instruction. She said nothing for 1 full second. Then she turned back to Mr. Beale. The Morley Daughters system, as I was saying, she runs it entirely from a single ledger. The efficiency of it is remarkable. The second that followed was different from all the seconds that had come before it in the evening. Then Edmund Caro behind her said, "Which poem?" He said it to the room, or perhaps to Cecily, but Alina heard it as addressed specifically and only to herself. She turned. He was looking at her. "At the Harrington house," he said, "which poem were you reading?" The room was listening. The room was always listening, but it was doing it differently now, in the way a room listens when it understands that what is being said is not what the script indicated. Alina told him. His expression moved by something small. "I know it," he said. Then, after a moment, he said the next line. The line hung in the air of the drawing room for a moment that seemed longer than it was, the way certain moments do when the room has stopped producing the ordinary sounds that mark the passage of time. No one moved to fill it. Edmund Caro stood with the line still evident in the quality of the air around him, not waiting for acknowledgement, simply having said the thing because the thing was true and it belonged to the moment, and that was his only reason for anything. Alina looked at him. She had been looked at in many ways in 27 years. She had been looked at with pity and with indifference and with the specific kind of warmth that means I see you enough to be kind to you. She had been looked at by rooms and found wanting, and by individuals and found sufficient. She had been looked at by her mother and found complicated. She had been looked at by Cecily and found useful. She had not, in her adult memory, been looked at the way Edmund Caro was looking at her now, which was the way you look at something when you have found what you were looking for and are simply registering the fact. Dinner was announced. The room began to move. The particular moment, which had lasted perhaps 7 seconds in total, dissolved into the sound of 40 people finding their direction and moving toward it. Alina let the movement carry her. She walked with the group toward the dining room and found her seat and unfolded her napkin and looked at the candles that had been lit along the center of the table. Edmund Caro was seated 4 places to her right. This was not far enough for what had just happened to become abstract. She could see him without turning her head more than a slight angle. She could see the way he sat in his chair, the same quality of inhabiting space without claiming it. He was talking with Gerald Ashworth, who was seated across from him, about something she couldn't hear, and he was attending to it with the same seriousness he brought to everything, which meant Gerald was the beneficiary of his complete attention and was visibly finding this pleasant. Cecily was at the far end of the table. Alina did not look at her for the first 2 courses. She was not avoiding her. It simply did not occur to her to look, because there was enough to think about in what was immediately in front of her, the conversation to her left about a proposed railway extension, the excellent soup, the question of the poem. The poem had been in her life for 4 years, since the book had come to her in an unremarkable way, bought from a market stall in the rain because the cover was the right color, and the price was whatever she had in her coat pocket that day. She had read it in the carriage home and sat still on the last page for 10 minutes in the way you sit still when something has described a part of you that you had not yet found language for. She had not expected anyone at Ashworth Park to know it. She had certainly not expected the second verse to be produced, quietly and without flourish, into the drawing room by Edmund Caro. By the fish course, the table had settled into its conversational groupings, and Alina was free, in the way the third day of a gathering makes you free, to sit inside her own thoughts without owing the person beside her more than occasional attention. She thought about the morning in the garden and Cecily's carefully packaged warning. She thought about the library and the hour of reading without explanation. She thought about the way he had said which poem, and the way the room had received it, the barely perceptible shift of 50 people recalibrating who was being considered in relation to whom. The wine course arrived. Gerald Ashworth said something that made Edmund Caro smile, a brief, contained thing, not the full-faced smile of performance, but the smile of someone who has found something genuinely amusing and is acknowledging it without inflation. She had not seen him smile before. She filed this too. After dinner, the party moved in the usual direction toward the drawing room, the library, the card tables. Elena found herself in the library again, not by plan but by the pull of it, the same pull that brought her there every evening, the smell and the quiet and the sense of being in a room that was not waiting for anything from her. She had been there for 10 minutes when he came in. He did not announce himself. He did not apologize for the intrusion. He came in, saw her standing at the shelves, and said, "You left early." "I come here every evening." He accepted this. He moved to the shelves on the opposite wall and studied them with his hands clasped behind his back. "The book you gave me yesterday," he said, "the second section." "Yes, you were right about the first." She turned slightly to look at him. "Everyone starts with the first. And the second is better because it doesn't explain itself." Yes, she looked back at the shelf in front of her. The first is for people who need to be led in. The second is for people who already know where they are and just want to be accompanied there. A pause. The house was doing its night settling around them, the small sounds of a large building releasing the tensions of the day. "Which are you usually?" he said. She thought about it seriously. "I've spent most of my life being led into rooms." "That isn't what I asked." She turned fully to look at him. He was looking at her with the directness that she had decided, over the course of 3 days, was not a challenge but simply his natural register, the way some people look when they are actually paying attention. "The second," she said, "I know where I am." He nodded. "I thought so." She moved to the chairs and sat down. He remained standing at the shelf for a moment, then pulled a book, crossed the room, and sat in the chair opposite. He opened the book to somewhere in the middle. She did not ask where. She opened her own book, the one she had carried down. They read for a while in the way they had yesterday, the particular silence of 2 people reading in the same room who do not need the room to be filled. Then he said, without looking up, "Your cousin tells stories well." Elena kept her eyes on her page. "She does. She told one tonight that wasn't kind." She turned a page. "She thought it was." He looked up. "Does that change what it was?" She considered this for longer than the question required, because it was a better question than it sounded. "It changes what she's accountable for," she said finally. "It doesn't change the story." He was quiet. He looked down at his book, then back at her. "You didn't defend yourself." "There was nothing to defend. You were reading a poem in a garden. There's no version of that that requires defense." She looked at him over the top of her book. "You'd be surprised what requires defense in certain rooms." He held her gaze. "I wouldn't actually." This was new information about him. She held it without comment. "What was the rest of the poem?" he said. She knew he wasn't asking if she knew it. He was asking her to say it. There was a difference. She sat still for a moment, looking at the middle distance past his shoulder, and then she said the next verse and the one after it and the last one, which she had always thought was the best and which, she realized as she said it aloud in the quiet of the library, she had never said aloud to anyone before. He listened without moving. When she finished, the silence was of a different quality than the silence before she had spoken. "There," he said, "that's what the garden would have had." She looked at him. "It didn't know that." "Rooms rarely do." He went back to his book. After a moment he added without looking up, "For what it's worth, I would not have laughed." She said nothing. She did not need to. They read for another half-hour. She left first, this time because she was tired, and the tiredness was coming from somewhere good, the specific tiredness of a day that has been thoroughly inhabited. She gathered her book and stood, and he rose automatically, which was the habit of his generation and his position, but she had the impression that he would have done it regardless of either. "I'll see you at breakfast," she said. "Yes," he said, "just that." But there was something in it, the simple certainty of it, that made it feel different from a statement of fact. She went upstairs. Ada had left water in the pitcher and a small lamp burning on the writing desk. Elena sat in front of the lamp for a moment without opening her notebook. She thought about the poem, about saying it aloud in a room that was quiet enough to receive it. She thought about the drawing room, the story, the laughter, and then the silence after which poem landed. She thought about what Cecily had said in the garden, "Don't read too much into it." She opened her notebook. She wrote one sentence. Then she closed it. She went to the window and looked out at the kitchen garden, which was only darkness now. The shapes of things she knew were there, the rows and the paths and the wall at the far end. Somewhere in that darkness, the lavender she had sat beside that afternoon was doing whatever lavender does in the dark, existing without performance, being exactly what it was. She stood there for a while. Then she went to bed. On the fourth morning, Elinor woke with the sense of a changed house. She could not identify it from the quality of the light or the sounds from below, both of which were identical to the previous mornings. It was something else, a difference in the atmosphere of the place, the way you sometimes know, before you are properly awake, that something has shifted in the order of things without yet knowing what or how. She lay still for a moment, letting herself wake fully before she examined the feeling. She decided after several minutes that the shift was in herself. She had been at Ashworth Park for 4 days. She had 1 day remaining. In the arithmetic of reunions, the 4th day had a different character than the previous 3. It was the day on which people made what they wanted of what remained, tying loose ends or creating new ones or simply running through the established enjoyment of the gathering one more time before the dispersal. She dressed and went down to breakfast. The morning room was fuller than usual for the hour, which was early, and the atmosphere in it was lighter than it had been since the first day, the levity of people who have come through the organized intensity of a gathering and found each other on the other side of it. George was there, reading. Mrs. Hartley was there with her letters, which she had been writing answers to throughout the week. Oliver and Harriet were there side by side with the particular ease of a long-married couple who have used a family gathering to remember why they liked each other. Edmund Carew was not there. Elinor filled a plate and found a chair near the window, her usual chair, and began to eat. He arrived at 9:10. He came in the way he always came into rooms, without signaling his arrival, without needing the room to arrange itself around him. He filled a cup of coffee at the sideboard and crossed to the window and sat in the chair beside Elinor, the chair beside her, not the chair across. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. They ate in silence. This was, Elinor thought, the test of something, not a test either of them had arranged, but the kind that arrives naturally when the preliminary work of getting to know someone is over, and what remains is the actual person in the actual morning. She ate her breakfast and he drank his coffee, and the room moved around them in its pleasant, half-awake way. Then he said, "I'm thinking of leaving today." She looked at him. "The reunion ends tomorrow." "I know," he turned his cup in his hands. "There's a matter in town that needs attention sooner than I had planned." She looked out the window. "Then you should go." A pause. "I don't particularly want to." This was said with the plainness of someone who has decided that the efficient thing is to say what is true. She had noticed this about him over 4 days, not just the directness but the particular kind of it, the directness of someone who found indirectness expensive and had decided long ago not to pay for it. "Then stay," she said. He looked at her. "I'll stay." She ate a piece of toast. This was, she was aware, an extraordinary exchange in the context of who they were and where they were. 2 people at a breakfast table, in a house full of family and history and careful social architecture. The decision that had just been made had no particular dramatic weight in its surface. No one in the room would have registered it as significant, and yet she felt the weight of it as something real, and for the first time in several years of gathering in rooms like this one, something that was hers. The morning proceeded. There was a plan, organized by Frances with the efficiency she brought to the management of 40 people, for a picnic on the east grounds. Everyone was expected. Blankets and baskets were being carried out by the household staff from 10 o'clock, and by 11 the east lawn held a pleasant arrangement of people and food, and the ambient warmth of a late summer day that had, just this once, decided to cooperate. Elinor sat on a blanket with Mrs. Hartley and Oliver's wife Harriet, who was quieter than her husband and funnier in private, which was a combination Elinor had always found she liked. They ate and talked about things that were neither trivial nor weighty, the particular register of conversation that surfaces on the 4th day of a gathering, honest and easy, no longer performing. Cecily moved through the picnic as she moved through everything, from group to group, spending time evenly distributed with the instinct of someone ensuring that everyone has had their due. She came to Alina's blanket at 11:30 and sat for 20 minutes and was excellent company, as she always was when she was not doing anything particular. She talked about a trip she was planning to the Lake District in the autumn and whether Alina would come. Alina said she might and meant it, and Cecily looked genuinely pleased. Edmund Carew was with Gerald and Oliver on the far side of the lawn, standing rather than sitting, talking with the ease of people who have run out of formal topics and have moved into the kind of conversation that moves where it wants to. He did not look toward Alina's blanket. She noticed this and decided it was information about a particular kind of care. After the picnic, the afternoon organized itself in the way of the last full days of such gatherings, people drifting into the house and back out, the last conversations happening with a slightly heightened quality because both parties were aware of the ending they were moving toward. Letters were written, promises were made, arrangements were loosely sketched. Cecily found Alina in the garden at 3, in the rose bed that was now approaching its real color, 3 days ahead of its best but close enough to suggest it. She came around the corner of the hedge and stopped when she saw Alina, and then came on without slowing, which meant she had been looking for her. She sat on the bench near the roses and patted the space beside her with the gesture of someone who has decided to have a particular kind of conversation and is arranging the conditions for it. Alina sat. For a moment Cecily said nothing. This was unusual. Cecily was rarely at a loss for words. She was assembling them, Alina thought, which was different from lacking them. Then she said, "I owe you something." Alina waited. Last night Cecily looked at the roses rather than at Alina. "The story I told in the drawing room," a pause, "I've told it before. It's always seemed like the kind of story that was about something funny, something we could both look back at. I don't think I had noticed." She smoothed her dress. "I noticed last night." Alina said nothing. "He was standing right behind you," Cecily said. "When I looked up, just standing there having heard it." She finally turned to look at Alina. "I felt awful, I want you to know that." Alina looked at her cousin's face, at the genuine discomfort in it, at the way Cecily was managing even this, even the apology, with a care for how it was received, but she was also genuinely there, genuinely uncomfortable, genuinely trying. "I know you did," Alina said. "It was unkind." "It was." Cecily held her gaze. "I don't always know when I'm being unkind," she said. "That's the thing, I'm telling you not as an excuse but because," she paused, "I think you should know that I actually don't always know." This was more honest than Alina had expected. She sat with it for a moment. "I know," she said again, and this time it meant something different. Cecily exhaled. She looked back at the roses. After a moment she said, "He's going to write to you." She said it the way she said things she had decided not to manage, plainly, without embellishment. "He told Gerald. Gerald told Harriet. Harriet told me." A brief, complicated pause. "He's going to write when he's back in London." Alina looked at the roses. "All right," she said. Cecily was quiet for a moment. Then very quietly she said, "You're not nothing, you know. You never were." Alina did not respond immediately. She looked at the roses, at the color they were showing at the tips, the red that was coming but had not fully arrived. She thought about what it cost Cecily to say that, and why it had taken 27 years to be said. "I know," she said finally. Cecily stood. She smoothed her skirt. She looked down at Alina with an expression that Alina had not seen on her face before, something that was past the warmth and the strategy and all the careful management of it, something more original than any of that. "Good," Cecily said. She walked back through the garden toward the house, her footsteps even on the gravel, her back straight, her shoulders carrying the precise weight they always carried. Alina sat with the roses. She did not analyze the conversation. She simply sat with it, the way you sit with something true after it has been given to you, letting it settle into the space where it belongs. The light was doing the amber thing again. The bees were still working. Everything in the garden was exactly what it was. The last morning at Ashworth Park arrived with the quality of an exhale. The house had been at full breath for 5 days, 40-odd people occupying every corner of it with their particular presences, their habits and voices and the small routines they had established over the course of the week. Now the exhale was beginning. Trunks were being carried to carriages. The hallway held the specific atmosphere of a leave-taking. both lighter and heavier than ordinary mornings. Alina had packed the night before, as she always did, which meant her morning was free, and she used it the way she used free mornings, in the library, not reading anything in particular but simply being in the room. Ada had come to say goodbye in the specific way of people who are not expected to say goodbye and who do it anyway because they mean it. She said she hoped Miss Voss would come back next time. Alina said she hoped so too. Ada smiled and went back to work. Mrs. Hartley had given Alina a letter. It was the letter she had been drafting responses to during the week, the one to the Drainage Committee, and she had added a paragraph at the end citing the conversation she had had with Alina as the source of a revision she had made to her primary argument. She gave it to Alina folded and said without ceremony, "You improved it." Alina had thanked her and meant it. Oliver had come to say goodbye in the hallway and had shaken her hand and said, too casually to be casual, that they should have dinner before the year was out. His wife Harriet had kissed Alina's cheek and said she was glad to have had the chance to properly talk, which was the specific kind of glad that meant it hadn't happened before and that was being marked now. Cecily came to her room at 10. She sat on the edge of the bed and they talked for 20 minutes about the Lake District, and then about London, and then about nothing specific, which was its own kind of specific. Cecily, Alina thought, was different today in a way that was subtle and that Alina suspected Cecily herself might not have identified. Something had released, something small, something old. She was still entirely herself, entirely the radiant, organized, affectionate person she had always been. But there was less management in it this morning, less engineering. She was simply there in the blue room above the kitchen garden, sitting on the edge of the bed, talking. When she left she said, "You'll write, won't you, properly, not just when I write first?" "I'll write," Alina said. Cecily paused at the door. "He didn't join the picnic group in the afternoon," she said. "Yesterday, he was looking for you in the garden and you'd gone to the East Pond." Alina said nothing. "I'm just telling you," Cecily said, then she went. Alina sat with that for a moment. At 11, Edmund Caro knocked at the door of the library, which was where she had returned after the goodbyes. He came in and stood in the middle of the room and said, "Your carriage is at noon." "Yes, mine is at 1, he looked at the shelves, "half an hour." "There's a garden view from the east window that's worth seeing before you go," she said. "The light is good at this hour." It was not about the light. They both knew it was not about the light. He crossed the room and stood at the east window, and she came to stand beside him, and they looked out at the garden, and the stone wall and the lavender beds at the far end, where a single bee was making its rounds with the efficiency of something that had been doing this since before the house existed, and would be doing it after. "I'll write when I'm in London," he said. "I know." He looked at her, "You know. Harriet told Cecily, who told me, families are efficient." Something moved across his face that was as close to amusement as she had seen him come. "I had planned to tell you myself." "You can still tell me," she said. "It will be a formality, but I won't object to it." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I have a copy of the collection, the one the poem is from. Both volumes, I'll send the second one." He paused. "My copy, not a new one, I've read it, there are notes in the margins." She looked at him. This was, she knew, the most he would offer. It was, she also knew, considerably more than it sounded like. "Send it," she said. They stood at the window for the remaining minutes before her carriage was called, saying nothing in particular and several important things in the way that silence carries important things when the two people in it are not afraid of it. The footman knocked at the door of the library to say the carriage was ready. Alina turned from the window and gathered her coat from the chair. He did not move to stop her, and she did not move slowly. She went to the door and he followed because he was going out anyway, his own carriage to check on, his own departure to arrange. They crossed the entrance hall together. Cecily was there, saying goodbye to Charlotte and Phoebe, and she caught Alina's eye over Charlotte's shoulder and held it for a second with an expression that was entirely unmanaged and therefore entirely real. Alina held it back. Outside, the gravel drive held 3 carriages being loaded and 6 people milling in the late morning sun. Frances Ashworth was performing the farewell with the same precision with which she had managed every other hour of the week, warm and organized, standing at the top of the steps and seeing people off with a specific word for each person, a specific memory invoked, a specific sentiment deployed. She took Alina's hands and said, "You were wonderful this year. I don't know why I always worry about you. You always find your feet. Elinor smiled. Thank you, Aunt Frances. She descended the steps to her carriage. The footman held the door. She turned at the last moment, not because she had planned to, but because she did. Edmund Carew was standing on the gravel, not at the top of the steps but at the bottom of them, where the drive began to curve. He was watching her with the expression she had been reading all week, attentive, present, not performing any particular thing. She nodded. He nodded back. She got in the carriage. The door closed. The carriage began to move, the crunch of gravel under the wheels, the slight pull as the horses found their pace, the view through the glass changing as the house began to fall away behind her, the gates coming into frame and then passing, the road opening out beyond them. She did not look back. She did not need to. She sat in the carriage with her hands folded in her lap and her coat around her shoulders, and the sketchbook in her bag with the 3 pencil lines she had abandoned in the garden. She thought about the week with the particular clarity that arrives the moment you are outside a thing, looking back at it from the road. She thought about the games and the library and the poem said aloud in a quiet room. She thought about the drawing room and the story and the silence after which poem. She thought about the conversation with Cecily in the rose garden, the small, honest, completely unexpected thing that had been said. She thought about a man standing at the bottom of the steps on the gravel drive, watching her go, with no particular expression on his face beyond the one that was simply his. Outside the carriage window, the road moved beneath the wheels and the landscape opened up into the country that lay between Ashworth Park and her own house. The fields and hedgerows and the occasional farm set back from the road, ordinary and present, and not asking anything of her. She opened her notebook. She crossed out the 3 pencil lines. She wrote something else instead. She wrote for most of the journey home, with the notebook on her knee and the pencil moving steadily, writing the kind of thing that is not a letter and not a story, but a way of knowing what she thought now that she was far enough from the room to think it. When she arrived home and her own house closed around her, with its particular smell and light and the specific sound of its own settling, she put the notebook on her writing desk and her traveling bag by the wardrobe and sat down in the chair by the window of her own room and looked out at her own garden. Her garden was not grand. It was small and slightly overgrown in the east corner where she kept meaning to deal with the ivy and kept choosing to paint instead. It had a stone wall much shorter than the one at Ashworth Park and a gate that needed a firm push to open properly. It was entirely, completely, undeniably hers. She sat in the chair and looked at it. 3 days later, the book arrived. A slim volume, the second in the collection, wrapped in plain paper. She unwrapped it at the writing desk with the quality of attention you bring to something you have been waiting for without knowing how much. The cover was worn at the corners. The spine had been read open and reread and opened again until it yielded naturally to any page. She opened it. The margins were written in, not heavily, sparsely, the way a person who chooses their words carefully chooses them, even in margins, a phrase here, a question there, a single underline that meant he had read a line and felt it land. She turned to the second section. She read. At the bottom of the page of the poem she had said aloud in the library at Ashworth Park, in the margin, in handwriting that was compact and entirely unhurried, were 4 words. Not a line of the poem, not a quotation. 4 words that were simply, plainly, unmistakably his. She sat at the writing desk for a long time. Then she got out her own pen and opened her notebook and began to write a letter. Not a carefully managed letter, not a performed one, not the assembled version of what she had heard. She wrote the way she had finally, over the course of 5 days in a house full of people who mostly looked past her, remembered how to write, directly from the place where she actually was, trusting the person on the other end to know where that was. She signed it. She folded it. She put it in an envelope and wrote the address in her own hand and set it on the corner of the writing desk where she would not forget it. She did not forget it. And 3 weeks later, when a letter arrived in return written in the same compact and unhurried hand, she read it standing at the window of her garden with the morning light coming in sideways and turning everything in the room to gold. And she stood there until she had read every word twice, and then she went to make tea, and then she came back and read it again, and this time she was smiling before she reached the second line. The book was still on the desk, the margins were still full. She had added 3 notes of her own, in pencil, very small in the spaces he had left her. She thought as she poured the tea that this was perhaps the beginning of a conversation that would take a very long time, which was precisely what made it feel, for the first time in a very long time, like something she did not want to rush. She drank her tea. Outside, the garden was doing what it always did, existing without explanation in the morning light, the ivy in the east corner still waiting to be managed, the gate still needing its firm push, the whole small, imperfect, entirely hers piece of the world going about its business without asking for her attention. She gave it her attention anyway. She had always been good at paying attention to the things that did not demand it.